With what has just been stated, and which may seem to deprecate the supper, its being an ordinance eminently calculated for the confirmation of our faith, is nowise incompatible. The very grant of the use of sensible signs, considered as an accommodation to our imperfect state, contributes to this end, and particularly the grant of such signs as, differing from those of the law, proclaim the atonement to be past and divine justice fully satisfied. But we cannot suppose that God would have his people constantly under the sensible pledges of his favor. He well knows that this, from the very operation of the infirmities he designed to counteract, would have a tendency to frustrate the end proposed, would render common and familiar, as other institutions, what he meant to have a striking and strongly confirming effect. Hence also, if he would consult the eminent promotion of grace which depends on this effect, and for which the ordinance as adapted to that end is peculiarly calculated, we must obey its claim on occasional observance. Attend we next to the service implied or performed in communicating. Everyone knows that vowing should be only an occasional exercise. So strong is the conviction of this, that the friends of stated weak dispensation find it necessary to discard the idea of vowing wholly from the observance of the supper. And here a footnote. In some of their reasonings on this head, the ideas of vowing and swearing are confounded. A vow, however, is only a solemn promise to God. An oath may be added, but a vow does not necessarily imply an oath, nor is the idea of an oath to be attached to the supper considered as an ordinance of vowing. It neither exacts nor imposes an oath. It is styled a sacrament, merely according to the primary and principal meaning of the term, as denoted a peculiarly holy ordinance in the Shorter Catechism, question 92. But let us even hold by the amount of the exercise and profession of communicants as declared by the Apostle, that showing of the death of Christ in which they engage must be something of a very public nature. It is of all the acts of Christian worship, that in which the most open and explicit avowal of the cross of Christ is made. The failing must therefore be great in regard to the nature and object of this profession. If the supper be not celebrated in the most public manner, if it be not distinguished by the mode and times of observance from the ordinary profession made every Sabbath in Christian worship. Instead of following out this summary sketch and detailed argument, we may simplify the subject by stating three general conclusions from the nature and use of the ordinance, which ought to regulate in regard to observance. If the view formerly given be just, then the Lord's Supper is an ordinance of great spiritual utility. It is a most solemn ordinance, and it is specially provided for manifesting the unity of the body of Christ. Number 1. It is an ordinance of great spiritual unity. This requires no particular proof. It is admitted on all hands. A copious and animated illustration of its importance to the Christian life may be found in Mr. Mason's second letter on communion. To this idea, indeed, the author wisely confines his view of the ordinance. It is the only idea that can subserve the point he meant to establish. But the supper is also, number 2, peculiarly solemn. Of late, indeed, there has been much declamation, and even by some Presbyterians, against accounting one ordinance more solemn than another. The arguments usually brought forward are, first, that the same authority is interposed in every divine institution; secondly, that the object of worship is all the same. That the object of worship is the same in all; and thirdly, that in all there is the same spiritual reference, namely to the mediation of Christ. The first of those arguments will prove that every ordinance is entitled to respect in its own place, and that one ought to be neglected in its proper season, nor observed at the expense of another. The second will prove that in no instance ought we to approach without reverence and godly fear, and the third that there is no access to God but through Jesus Christ. What they prove in regard comparative solemnity, for all the ordinances of God are solemn, may appear from the following considerations. First, the discriminating marks of comparative solemnity are not touched in these arguments. They confessedly relate to what is common to all sacred institutions. It was incumbent on those who adduced them to have proved that there could be nothing peculiar in regard to one ordinance more than another, or to have shown that their arguments established this point and set aside the possibility of anything peculiar. Secondly, if admitted to determine question of comparative solemnity, the arguments specified will prove too much, when they prove that no peculiar solemnity could attach to any of the Old Testament institutions more than to any of the New. The same authority, for instance, was interposed, the same God was the object of worship, and the reference to the mediation of Christ was as real in the daily sacrifice as in the Passover feast. Will it be said it was the convocation of the people that rendered the last peculiarly solemn? Then, here is a circumstance different from anything specified in the arguments. It is, however, only an extraneous circumstance, and one, moreover, which will scarcely be resorted to by their adversaries of comparative solemnity, who are no friends to solemn convocations. The arguments so confidently propounded, if admitted to decide the question, would prove that it is utterly impossible, even with God, to constitute one ordinance more solemn than another. But with God nothing is impossible, sin excepted, of which, if he were capable, he would be no God. And surely the ordination of comparative solemnity, though but in condescension to our weakness, is not like sin, contrary to his nature. Therefore, thirdly, the discriminating marks of peculiar solemnity are to be sought in the manner in which the divine authority has been interposed, the form in which the approach is to be made to the object of worship, and the mode of reference to Christ's mediation, with other additional circumstances which may tend to impress the mind or draw forth serious regard. As to the manner in which the divine authority has been interposed, it is nearly the same in regard to all the institutions of grace, lest any advantage should have been taken to neglect some and overrate others. Yet even on this head, the methods of divine wisdom for producing a peculiar effect may well engage our admiration. The authority that ordained and sanctioned sacrifice from the beginning was the same that appointed the legal modes of worship. But the manifestation of the grandeur of that authority on Sinai, when God descended with the sound of a trumpet, was awfully impressive. The command in regard to one institution may be more express, or the sanction may be more awful than in regard to another. It is of no consequence here whether that sanction be given forth in so many words, or implied and notified to conscience in the very nature of the ordinance. In fine, God may more specially vindicate his authority with respect to one institution than another, and show that it is peculiarly his will, that in it, particularly he will be sanctified of all them that draw nigh unto him. Apply these remarks to the Lord's Supper, and consider its immediate appointment by Jesus, and not when giving general directions about the kingdom of heaven, nor in the way of combining it with other ordinances, as he did baptism with teaching in one general mandate, but by itself, the practical institution with which it was honored, the express command, "Do this in remembrance of me," nothing similar to which took place in regard to the Sabbath and various other articles of Christian order. That too his dying command, delivered in circumstances calculated to impress deeply on the heart, and authority interposed. The revelation of this ordinance afterwards from his state of glory, to Paul, a revelation made in the very terms of first institution, and thus not only a new act of authority, but one manifestative of peculiar regard. Lastly, the awful sanction in 1 Corinthians 11, verse 29, with the special vindication of the ordinance on such as had profaned it, in verse 30.